Running this morning?
Yeah, I think I got it working this time.
We're both related. We don't have a job. Just make sure.
Really hoping that I'll launch on.
And guess what? 100%.
No offense to you, Stan.
What was that?
How are you?
Good to see everyone here this morning. It's good to be back in town after traveling for a bit. Let's go ahead and open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. And we'll be wrapping up this chapter this morning and getting to chapter 6 as the class goes on. But as we begin, Carl, could you lead us in an opening prayer?
Most kind and loving Heavenly Father, hallowed be thy name. Heavenly Father, thank you today for this beautiful Lord today. Thank you thee above all for thy Son and our Savior, and the word that we have through him. Pray, Heavenly Father, that we will study thy word this morning, that we might be better equipped to do thy will. Thank you for all of your many blessings of life. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
So as we begin this morning, I know you guys made it down through about verse 45, but let's go ahead and read verses 43 through the end of the chapter, and we'll pick up from there and finish this chapter out. So verses 43 through 48. And Chris, can you read those for us?
You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you want your will only, what do you more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect.
All right, so we have another one of these contrasts, like we've been reading quite a bit about in Matthew chapter 5, of these misconceptions that they had heard about the law in ways that it was interpreted and told to them that represent what was at the heart of God's will in His law. And you guys discussed a lot of that in your previous classes last week on on how the law didn't have the principle of hating your enemy within it, and yet they that is what they were hearing. That is what they had interpreted certain things to mean, and they were misapplying the law to kind of get to that point. But rather, there's quite a challenge posed to us, even though it's consistent with the law, doesn't mean that it's easy when it comes to loving your enemies and treating them well, treating them the way we see God treating even those who are opposed to Him, even those who are His enemies. And of course, those were things like loving and blessing and doing good, praying for them. And in your last class, you were probably ending there in verse 45, where basically is describing the reasons why we are to act this way, the reason why we are to have this kind of attitude and disposition towards even those who we might consider enemies or opponents, or those who may be against us in some way. And so, what is the reason given for why we need to react this way? Carl?
Well, 45. God blesses the evil as He blesses us with the rain, sunshine. So we're all God's children in His sight. We're not all living in accordance to His will, but if God rains these blessings down upon these evil people, that's an attitude that we should have. We just went through these other verses. To love your enemies. God loves the people that are evil. He wants them to be saved. But He's trying to get that idea over to these people. That's how we're supposed to be.
Right, and I think that gets to the heart of it, is that He's not just blessing them indiscriminately. He's blessing them because He loves them. Right, so it even gets to the character of God, to the heart of God, in why He's doing that. Is that He has love. He had love for us before we were His children, when we were sinners. He still has love for sinners today. The next generation of people who are who He wants to and desires to have a relationship with. Right, God is love. It's what motivates Him. It's what is reflected in all the actions that He does, in the good that He does, even to those who oppose Him, even to those who don't pay Him any mind. He still sees fit to bless them in some ways, and of course, not in all the ways that they don't enjoy all of the blessings that His children have and have to look forward to, but He does extend His love to them, and that's what we're called to do. And in doing so, what are we demonstrating? In emulating our Father, what does that make us?
We're emulating love.
Okay, we're emulating his love,
Yeah.
but according to verse 45 here, we become his children when we do that. That we are sons of God when we imitate our Father, right? As far as our character goes, just like a child imitates their parents, and they reflect the traits of the parent. And that's exactly what that relationship is like when we choose to love enemies. And
Well, it also shows that we are obeying our Father,
mm-hmm,
and that is important that, as you say, we emulate him and we obey what he tells us to do, just like what is in the Bible.
mm-hmm. Right, we want to imitate him because we see that, and we see it extended to ourselves in the past, right? When we've been, we read about him being kind to those who are unthankful, to those who are involved in evil things, and all of us have been there at times. There are many people who are there. It's easy to fall back in those kind of attitudes, but yet God's love is always extended even to those, and him showing the love, being kind to them, providing for them. And as taught in many other places, and I'm not sure how much you got into this on Wednesday, so we won't go through all these, but we're told many times to imitate our Father. And then that's exactly what we're being called to do here. Grumpy?
Yeah, Ephesians 5, first two verses. It says, this is under the new law then. It says it's the same. Be you therefore followers of dear children and walk in love, which Christ also has loved us and has given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet smelling savor. We're to imitate Christ. And what he did, Romans 5 verse 8, it says he died for us while we were sinners.
Right.
Colossians 1:21 says we were enemies by wicked works, enemies in our mind. So
Mm-hmm.
Christ died for his enemies. He demonstrated love for enemies.
Right. Yeah, and even just going back a verse from where you started, going back to chapter 4, because verse 5 begins with "Therefore be imitators," and you go back, and what he's telling us to do, in order to do that, is to be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. So it's kind of thinking to how God treated us when we were separate from him, and using that to shape our attitudes towards those around us, to imitate that same kind of thing, because there's going to be many people who don't appreciate us, who aren't kind to us, who don't love us, who are against us in some way. But that doesn't exclude them from, shouldn't exclude them from our concern, our care, and our love. Terry?
Wasn't it Paul that said, be followers of me as I follow Christ?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and he was always pointing people to Christ, even though people were very familiar with him. He was of course a good example, but in as much as he followed Christ, that's where he always wanted to direct people's focus. And that's where we're being called to direct our focus. In loving our enemies, we're doing it with kind of a focus even beyond our enemies, but to God, and to emulating him and imitating him. Another reason that he gives for acting that way, as we see in the verses following in our main text, is that in doing so, not only are we being like sons to our Father in verse 45, we're also told in verse 46 that we react in that way because we're being separate. We're being different than the tax collectors, right? Which, of course, in their day, we've talked about this quite a bit. They were despised people by the Jews. They abused their positions. They made themselves wealthy and rich by collecting taxes even beyond what they were supposed to from from the Jews there on behalf of the Roman government. Chuck?
Yeah, the main reason we're to do all this is the commandment of God plus. That is the only way that we'll be perfect. Like God is perfect. In the latter verse there. That's the only way.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's some interesting things that we can gain from us, all these different parts of this, how he's making this point, right? That do this because you're being sons of God. Do this because you're called to act in a way that's beyond just what the normal people of the day, or even the evil people of the day. We don't want to limit ourselves to their standard, right? And what he's saying there in verse 46 is describing the standard set by people such as the tax collectors, right? Which is what's their attitude? How do they approach love? Because they have love, right? The tax collectors love, but how do they love? What's their standard? Chuck?
They're friends only. I've been there close. They're not their enemies.
Right. Well, they only reciprocate it, right? So it says they love those who love them, right? And that's something that's easy to do. That's something that's natural to do, right? That's something that we learn even from the smallest child, the relationship that they have with their parents, those that love them, and they can reciprocate that. You learn that from a very young age. And that could be a very healthy thing, right? But that's not the standard. That's not what we're being called to do. Is only that. Did I see another hand up over here? Oh, Terry, sorry, I thought there was somebody behind you.
It's very easy to love someone who loves you. It takes no effort whatsoever. My problem is, personally, I have problems with loving someone who is mean to me on purpose, who is going out of their way to make my life difficult. And we actually have a neighbor that is in this category. They go out of their way to make things difficult for us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, really hard. We have to try really hard to be kind. And it is not easy whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's so not easy. But it's easy to love my son. It's easy to love my sister. It's easy to love my husband. It's hard to love someone who is purposely being mean to you.
Yeah. Oh, I think if each of us don't have somebody in mind like that we're not gaining everything we could from these scriptures, because I think it does us well to think about who in our lives we would, even if it's not an enemy in a traditional sense, right? But somebody who opposes you or makes something difficult for you, somebody who it's hard to love, and to have that in mind when we're reading these things, because without that, how can we possibly apply this, right? How can we possibly see how this can change our approach to love if we don't have those kind of difficult situations in mind? I think it's good that you bring that up. Carl?
That last verse, 48, sums up the whole paragraph that we've been studying. If God loves everybody, we are to do the same. It's a mindset he's trying to get over to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
God does this. That's how God is. That's how we're supposed to be. As Terry said, and as this scripture here said, it's easy to love those that love us.
Right.
But those that don't love us, we're to love them too, because God does.
Yeah. And I think the only way to really do that too is with the focus on God, right? If our focus is just on the relationship that we have with that person, I mean, it could be almost impossible to have genuine love and genuine care and concern for somebody who opposes it, because it does. It's like it's unnatural in a way, right? It's not the way we naturally do things. But if we set our focus on God and how He loved us and how He loves others, it enables us. It enables us to kind of move beyond that the natural love we may have for someone to something higher, something that's beyond what the tax collectors and the Gentiles of the day, beyond their standard, to God's own standard, both in love and in different ways that's demonstrated. In verse 47, it talks about greeting, right? The greeting only your brothers, only those who you are in this relationship with. But he says that there's a standard higher than that. And like Carl points out, and like this chapter ends in summary here, kind of the third reason why we're to do that is to this idea of being perfect. All right, what does perfect mean in the Bible? Read about
Sometimes it means complete, sometimes it means without sin.
Yeah, well, it's something that's being brought to completion right here, like this particular word that's full grown, right? Sometimes it could even be translated mature, right? When something is growing into what it should be, and that's kind of the idea here is, the context of what we're reading here is about showing love. And Terry?
I just want to mention that because without telling everybody my age, I'm older. Okay, so even when you get as old as Carl, then you still have, you're going to always be striving to be perfect. You are not going to make perfection, but you have to strive for it forever until you die. Because I've gotten better as I've gotten older. I'm sure if I continue, I will get better as I get older. I'm never going to reach that total. I'm not going to reach Christ's level, but I have to try for it. No matter how old I get, no matter how mature I get, I still have to make an effort to make it to that perfection.
Right, or to emulate him more and more, right? Now, if we ever got to a point where we didn't need to emulate him more, we would be well, no, but I mean, like God is the only one who doesn't need to improve anymore. Like if he's the standard, of course we're always going to need to grow in like emulating him, right? Unless we are God, right? In which case we don't need to grow anymore. But until then, which isn't, that's not like God is the standard, and so we're always going to need to grow, to be brought into fuller completion, and there's always going to be something we lack that we can improve. Billy?
I guess, of course, has already been discussed that the Lord was perfect, and He gives us an example we should follow. But also, like in James 1, 2, 3, and 4, if I could read.
Yeah, James 1, verse 2, 3, and 4.
My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire and wanting nothing. So, see, our faith can give us a way to be more patient, where we can help that neighbor or help ourselves when he's doing something like Terry described.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's still difficult for anyone that's being, you might say, malicious intent to do harm to you or degrade you or something. Then you have to work with your faith so you can be patient with those people,
Mm-hmm.
as the Lord was.
Right. Yeah, I think those are all very good points. And in the passage that Billy was just reading, that idea of when steadfastness has its full effect, there in verse 4, it talks about being perfect and complete, which is it's basically saying that you become fully developed. That's kind of what we want. Of course, when we all start, we're immature in a lot of ways, right? When we're starting out, whether it's in our Christian walk, or even, of course, in our physical walk as well, is just growing up from children to adults. There's a lot of development that happens, and That's what we're being called to do here, and specifically in the context of love. This is saying that that love starts out immature, right? Love starts out just loving those who love us, right? But we're being called to complete that, right? I think like sometimes the word perfection, the way we use it now is often different than what we're reading about in the Bible, right? Which is being more fully developed, being more complete, and a love that's fully rounded out, right? Like God's love. God's love is complete, right? It's not lacking in anything. How do we know that? Because not only does he love those who love him, he also loves those who don't, right? His enemies. And so for our love to be complete, like God's is complete, also that's kind of the culmination of everything here. Love your enemies so that your love can be complete, like God's is complete. It's not that if we love our enemies, all of a sudden we are perfect and we have no flaws in our lives, right? Where the word perfect, that's what it means to us, but that's not how it's being used here. It's saying that our love to be complete requires not just loving those who love us, but going beyond that. So it's a love is fully developed, right? Towards all those, just like our Father has a love that's fully developed towards everyone. That's what we're striving for in this context here. So, Roger?
So James chapter 1,
Mm-hmm.
verse 13 says, God cannot be tempted by evil. Next verse says, each of us is tempted. So it's perfect like God can not be tempted by evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and that's definitely another way that we can I don't know, that we can emulate him, and to recognize that he's not the one doing the tempting, right? We don't want to have that misunderstanding. Any other comments? So let's go ahead and get into the next chapter here. And this kind of rolls right into it, because the thing that our love motivates us to do, right, is often going to require helping someone who may be in need. I'm not sure if you looked at some of the passages in the Old Testament that last week that proved that we were to have a concern for our enemies, and that even in the Old Testament it talked about it. That if your enemy got into trouble, like with it, like his animal crumpled under the weight that he was carrying, that you were to help him. You were to help him get on his way and help him up. And that's just one example of a way that you may help your enemy, but it's going to involve any number of good works that you and different ways of demonstrating that love and helping them out when they need it. And there's a warning that's given. I know it's a different chapter, but this is all kind of in the same flow here in chapter 6, of something to beware of when putting this love to use, right? When putting this love, this complete love, this mature, this perfect love to work in our lives, there's something that we need to be careful about. And so let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 4, and then we'll spend some time discussing this for the remainder of class. Sue, can you read verses 1 through 4?
Take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them, otherwise you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore, when you do these alms, do not sound the trumpet before thee as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand has done, that thine alms may be in secret, and that thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly.
Okay, so I think Sue's version read give heed to, or some versions may read back in verse 1 to beware. Beware of doing something. Now, does anybody's versions read differently than giving alms? What this folks? Good deeds. Okay. Any other ones, Roger? Charitable deeds. Okay, Billy. What was that? Gifts. Okay. Right. So we're going to find some different focuses on our, at least in verse 1. Verse 2, it's talking about giving to the needy, right? Giving alms. But up in verse 1, a lot of versions read differently because in like the King James and I think the New King James as well, the Greek word that's being used to translate alms in charitable deeds, that some versions read. The manuscripts that are based on are different than the ones that versions like the New American Standard or American Standard or even English Standard versions are based on manuscripts that are even older than that. And they had a Greek word which is similar, but it's different there in verse 1. It's often translated as righteousness. And so when we kind of look at the context here of chapter 6, verse 1 seems to be more of like an introduction to a more general idea of not just giving alms and being aware of giving alms before other people, but any righteous deed, any good deed. And that's going to cover things like where's my note on this? Like, so verse 2 begins talking about giving, right? Giving alms, which is like giving to those in need. Verse 5 talks about praying. And the same warning that's given up in verse 1 applies to all these things of being aware of practicing these things to be seen by people. So giving in verse 2, praying in verse 5, fasting in verse 16. Right? There's kind of a bigger context here where this thought's being carried through. So just this is the reason why we see some differences there in verse 1. I wanted to touch on that a little bit. And it seems more, as far as like the flow of text goes, it seems that verse 1 is talking more about a general righteousness, and then he gets into the specifics starting in verse 2 in giving alms. Did the religious people of the day, specifically the Pharisees, did they have trouble in their charitable things? Did they have trouble in giving? Actually, read they were pretty good at that, right? We read in multiple places that that in their giving, we know that they were faithful in giving their 10% to God. We know that in Luke 11, it talks about them tithing even the smallest amount of seed, right? So even if they just collected a little bit of seed from their field, they would even take 10% of that, right, to give to God. They were very specific about it. Roger?
Seems like they announced it at a press conference before they
Right.
made their.
Right. So the problem they had wasn't in the giving of it, right? It was in their attitudes while doing it, and the reason why what they were doing it for. And so there is a kind of charity that isn't pleasing to God, right? And that's kind of what's being addressed here, this kind of giving. And I think that would apply to any kind of righteousness, right? There's many ways to be righteous that wouldn't be pleasing to God, including being self-righteous and being righteous with the wrong motives, which we're going to be looking at in the study.
And basically what he's doing is the same thing he did up in verse 44, where he said, love your enemies, and then he breaks down who those enemies are.
Right.
And in verse 1 of chapter 6, he talks about these acts of righteousness, and then he breaks down various ones, but it's not limited to those, like you said.
Right. Yeah. These are just examples of that he sees around him. Right. He's just bringing forth some examples that people could relate to because they've seen they've seen the people praying out in the streets. They've seen the people who are sounding trumpets before them before they give. These are all things that the people of this time would be familiar with and would be able to relate to. And of course, as we kind of begin a lot of these classes with going back, that Jesus's goal in teaching these things, and he wanted his followers to have a righteousness that exceeded the scribes and the Pharisees. And we've been talking or looking at all the different ways in which something can exceed. It's not just doing it more exactly than they did, right? It's going deeper than they do as far as what our motives are in doing it and what we're seeking and when doing righteousness. And Jesus kind of keeps putting our focus back on our attitudes and on God as well, instead of on men and what they see. So if we had to sum up the basic principle that's being taught starting here in verse 6, how would you sum it up? They have these problems of making a show of their good deeds. What's wrong with that? What's the kind of the root cause of the problem that Jesus is addressing? Chris?
What you do needs to be done from the heart. Not just
Right. Yeah. So it's where it's coming from, and then it's where it's directed. Like, what are you trying to do with this, right? And Chris says pleasing God, which I think is exactly the direction he's trying to move their thinking into. We're not to do acts of righteousness to be seen by men. But that may cause something to come up in our minds that we studied pretty recently back in chapter 5. We're not to avoid our righteousness being seen by men, though, are we? Didn't we read? What did we read about in verse 16 of the last chapter?
Let our good works be seen,
Let them be seen.
so that they know that we are of God.
Yeah. Robbie?
Yeah, there's a good verse in Ephesians 6. Although here it's in a different context, it's talking about servants
Mm-hmm.
and being obedient to their masters. But he says in verse 6, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart.
Mm-hmm.
So you're doing it because God said to, and not to please men. So
Right.
It shows that the motive is here.
Yeah, and that's actually a good verse to look at because of the way it describes what you're doing when you're doing it to be seen, right? Which is eye pleasers, right? Pleasing some. Now there is a profession that's based on pleasing people with their eye that you watch, and it's fun to watch them do their thing, right? And that would be actors, right? Like on a stage play. Their whole purpose for existing is to be seen, right? It's to for us to look at them and their behavior and just like really get into what they're doing. And it's interesting that as we look down in our main text there, when it says not to sound the trumpet before us as the hypocrites do in verse 2, and that word hypocrites is literally actors or like stage performers, right? That's the idea behind the original word. And so kind of thinking of that idea of eye pleasers and of an actor, somebody who's putting on a show, right? Somebody who's doing it for the enjoyment, or actors more for the enjoyment, but more just for the recognition and the attention of those who are watching you. And so that's the idea that he's addressing here, when we know that our devotion to God, our good works shouldn't be something that we keep hidden from the world. But it's not something that is there for the world to see, and that's the reason why we're doing it, is just for people's recognition. And so he just as kind of an overview, he talks about this basic principle, and then there's consequences for ignoring it. There at the end of verse 1, he says, "For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." So when we seek of how to apply this to ourselves, when we think about our deepest intentions for doing things, for what drives us, what motivates us, if what we're doing is not meant to please and glorify God, we're being told that he won't reward us for that there's going to be nothing good that comes of that from him. And what we're going to see as we go through all these in following classes is that there is a reward that comes from having the wrong kind of attitude, but it's a very temporary one. It's one that's not coming from God, and it's one that's ultimately going to be completely unfulfilling. And so, again, I think we're out of time, but we'll get into this in future classes. But appreciate everyone's attention this morning.
Hey, good to be in service tonight.
Yeah.
You guys remind Grammy to bring some gifts for you, because you're probably gonna be leaving here, right?
Just for just quick, just one night up.
Yeah. It's good to be home, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, another good place, Hebrews 4:0, which shows that God knows the intention. You know, there's no fool with God.
Right.
You know why we do it. We got
Good.
Yeah. Called in second.
Yeah.
See what happens.